the last speaker on my list is Mr. Richard Hidarian. Hidarian is a fellow of ADR, South-based Institute of the Philippines. Mr. Hidarian, are you ready to take floor?
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador.
Yeah.
And thank you for the Diplomatic Academy for the kind invitation. I actually sent a PowerPoint. Maybe it could be projected because I'm having some problem uploading it. Usually speaking after lunch is not my favorite, and of course speaking the last in such a great panel is also not my favorite. It seems many topics and issues were already covered. But nonetheless, I really like this long view discussion because I think the long view discussion allows us to go beyond the more depressive or pessimistic aspects of our contemporary geopolitics in South China Sea in order to look at what could we do in the coming years and decades. Now, I know in the World Economic Forum and in Wall Street journals of this world, there's a lot of discussion about the fourth industrial revolution, that we're in the new phase of innovation when it comes to our industries and how that's going to change our lives and our world. I think the ASEAN is also facing in many ways what I could call a fourth reset or fourth soul searching. The first one was during the era of Confrontasi in the 1960s when the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and later on the emerging Singapore were at each other's loggerheads. So the Mapilindo in many ways and the Confrontasi were precursors for the creation of ASEAN. And then later on in the 70s and 80s, we faced the Indochina crisis and the question of admitting communist regimes and regimes with, on the other side of the Cold War fence into the ASEAN. And eventually we did that also very successfully. So we ended the Confrontasi. We were able to integrate Vietnam, Cambodia, and other countries into ASEAN. And then, of course, the third reset or soul searching we faced was in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Iron Curtain. And there, I think all of our discussions about ASEAN being in the driver's seat, and as Akavi said, having the driver's license to do that, came into being. But now I think we're facing a new era, and I think a fourth reset and a fourth rethink, that we can call that a post-Trump era or a post-American era. And I think this era in itself demands a significant degree of rethink on the part of ASEAN on what we want to happen in the future. For some reason, my PowerPoint is not being presented. The same thing happened to me 4 years ago there, but it's okay. We had a very detailed report with Brookings Institute earlier this year, ASEAN at the Crossroads, where I really break down these issues in detail, and perhaps later on that could be shared. But for our discussions today, because we have a very limited time, let me go to the relevance of why we need a big rethink in the ASEAN. I think what we're facing in ASEAN today is what we can call a middle institutional trap. It's very similar to the concept of middle income trap. Middle income trap is when policies that help you to go from low income to middle income will no longer help you in the next stage of development. I think in many ways, if you look at ASEAN, we're also facing a middle institutional trap, meaning the decision-making modalities that allowed us to bring 10 very diverse countries together quite successfully are no longer really helping us in dealing with the next stage of geopolitics, which is the rise of China and how to mediate regional security architecture amid rising tensions between the superpowers. I think that's a lot because of the fact that our understanding of muwafaqat, which in Arabic means something closer to consensus, is more or less unanimity. That if you don't have all countries on board on a sensitive issue like South China Sea, it's almost impossible for us to even get a robust statement on the South China Sea. So it's quite disconcerting that even though China has been changing the facts on the ground quite aggressively over the past decade, especially since 2030 December, hardly China is mentioned as kind of a threat to regional security. And the best we can do, and kudos to Vietnam for pushing the envelope this year, is to indirectly mention the threats that are posed by China. And that's the limitation that we face with this kind of a unanimity-based, decision-making modality. Let's also look at the fact that in the next 5 to 10 years, ASEAN is also going to face major, almost existential challenges If you look at climate change, for instance, my country, the Philippines, is among top 2 or top 3 most vulnerable countries in the world. Whether you look at the HSBC or German Watch kind of reports, and if you look at also the International Labour Organization report, more than 50% of jobs in manufacturing sector, which are very important to creation of employment and political stability and legitimization in Southeast Asia, from Cambodia and Vietnam to Philippines and Indonesia, could also be affected. So we're facing existential challenges to our political economic stability, if not prosperity, in the coming years and decades. And I think that demands some significant rethink on the role of ASEAN and how we should come together, how we should create an economic community, and the kind of cooperative mechanisms to help us to get through this. The other thing is that we have to keep in mind also that China is increasingly adopting a kind of a divide and conquer strategy, which makes it very impossible for us to come with consensus on important issues like South China Sea. All China has to do is to lean on one country or two, and then we're going to have a very serious problem. And that's where we see, in fact, in recent years, the tendency for us to come up with chairman's statement because of the lack of consensus. And I think that's not a very good sign for the ASEAN and the way we're moving forward. And lastly, of course, we have to talk about robust institutional responses that we need to new non-traditional security challenges, whether it is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or maritime piracy and terrorism and transnational crime. All of this most likely will get worse, not get better, in the coming years as we enter more economic uncertainty, economic instability, and accordingly political instability and polarization in years to come. So I think what's happening in the United States should be a wake-up call for more fragile democracies, or for that matter, fragile autocracies in Southeast Asia, who are also going to face their own economic shocks. Now, speaking of recommendations, I think this is where we have to be a little bit creative, a little bit think outside the box. I mean, it's lovely to talk about code of conduct and whether it's valuable or not. You know, from my point of view, a code of conduct which is legally binding is not necessarily good, especially if legally binding means China's version of international law, not the UNCLOS, not the Philippine-initiated arbitration award of 2016. I'll be also worried with the COC, which is legally binding, but excludes external players from energy exploration activities or their ability to conduct military exercises with individual countries. And it worries me that China has been injecting those points into the negotiations of COC over the past few years, and I'm glad that some of our neighbors have been pushing back. Nonetheless, I think we have to look at ways, first of all, to optimize consensus building. We have employed the ASEAN minus X formula in other realms of negotiation, whether this is, for instance, negotiations of AFTA CPT, ASEAN Free Trade Negotiations, and it kind of was successful. And I think it's time for us to discuss whether ASEAN minus X formula could also be applied to more sensitive geopolitical discussions like South China Sea. Why should we have all countries on board when all countries do not have the same threat perceptions or direct stake in the South China Sea? I mean, to be fair to Cambodians, they have no direct stake in the South China Sea, and they're too dependent on China to piece them off on this issue. So I think we have to think about other ways to come up with more effective decision-making modalities. I think our European friends, for instance, have the qualified majority voting modality, which even takes into consideration the differentials in demographics, among others. So why should a country with 500,000 people have as much vote as a country with 280 million people? As Aristotle said, treating unequal people equally is in a form of injustice in itself. The second thing I think is very important and practical is embracing me-lateralism. If ASEAN multilateralism is not going to step up to the plate, which it has not, and let's be very brutally honest about it, on sensitive issues like South China Sea, where parameters of geopolitical rivalry are most pronounced and dangerous, I think it's important for us to talk about mini-lateralism, meaning more coordination on an ad hoc basis among key countries within ASEAN on specific issues, including South China Sea. I think Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia can come together and discuss boundary issues. They can resolve their issues more in accordance with international law and the UNCLOS in ways that China will perhaps never agree under negotiation of code of conduct. And I believe under minilateralism, we should also talk about Quad plus minilateralism. I think there has to be more coordination among key countries within ASEAN and Quad countries, or our European partners, whether it's France, Germany, and United Kingdom, who are also having more say and more commitments in this part of the world. And lastly, I think this might sound crazy, but back in 2018, when we were in Australia having a strategic dialogue during the ASEAN-Australia Summit, some of our friends were discussing about the notion of associated membership, even for countries like Australia and New Zealand. And of course, we kind of laughed it off. But things could get so crazy and so unpredictable in years to come that we may need to have some serious discussion whether Australia and New Zealand, who are kind of our near to far neighbor, perhaps could have greater integration into the ASEAN framework and therefore make ASEAN a much more robust and effective driver of regional security. I mean, if you just look at the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, in my opinion, it just shows the weakness of ASEAN. It's an assertion of our centrality without any proof that we can be central. And that's why, accordingly, we have to have a big reset, our fourth big reset since the ugly days of confrontancy. We have come a long way, but the modalities that worked in the past may not work anymore as we face a new geopolitical reality. Thank you.
So, we thank you, Mr. Haidarian, for very comprehensive, very interesting comments and observations, and especially when you touch upon the question of the growing mini-lateral coordination among the key regional states. And it's very interesting, and we think that we may have other observation and comment on that. So now, we move upon the part of Q&A part of the section. And of course, we invite the comments and questions both from of our attendees, both online and in the room. The first question we got from Mr. Wang Tiha from the Institute of South Asia Studies in Singapore. And Mr. Wang Tiha, are you ready to raise the questions, and to whom?
Yes, can you hear me?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. I have two questions. The first one is to Mr. Mutsharu Nizam bin Umar from Brunei. As you know, this year, Vietnam, as the ASEAN chair, has taken a very robust legal approach to the South China Sea, especially in reinstating UNCLOS as the basis for determining maritime entitlement, sovereign rights, jurisdiction, and other interests, maritime interests in the maritime zones, and also as a legal framework for all activities in the oceans and the seas. This phrase has been reiterated in all chairman statements of ASEAN political security meetings this year. As the ASEAN chair next year, do you think Brunei will build upon this momentum of this principled approach and most specifically in maintaining this reference to UNCLOS? And the second question, since I have the floor, as all of you also already referred to in your presentation, China inserted in the current draft COC text a few provisions that aim to prevent regional countries from conducting military exercises with other powers in the South China Sea, and also to prevent foreign companies from outside the region from undertaking oil and gas development activities. From your national perspective and national interest, what is your assessment of this proposition, and if you have any chance to fly in the COC talks? I understand that there is a subsequent session on the COC later, but I still would love to hear the views from the speakers in this panel, given your caliber and influence as thought leaders in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ha. Uma, can you take response?
Thank you very much for that question. I'll talk about the provisions in the chairman's statement. Those provisions, most of them are not new, and we've been, Brunei has been, and most other ASEAN countries have been agreeing to the provisions during most of their chairmanship. And I don't see any reason why that cannot continue for next year. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brunei also released a statement on the importance of UNCLOS in managing possible disputes. So really, currently I don't see anything that can prevent continuing the pushing for the same provisions for next year. Of course, I'm not representing the views of my government. That's my personal view. Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Umar. Any questions, comments on the room? Yes, please, Ms. Ha. Ms. Ha, identify yourself and then raise question to whom from our panelists.
Thank you, the moderator. I am representing the Society of International of Vietnam here. I have perhaps one comment and one question.
Yes,
my
please.
comment goes to the remark made by Dino Jala. He was saying that in 2025 we would expect China to give us the coordinates of the 9-dash line. And my comment is that in the first place, I would have a very great doubt on such a request because according to the legal point of view, the 9-dash line doesn't have any lawful meaning. And we would not want to go ahead asking China to even officialize it by giving the coordinates. My question goes to the last speaker from the Philippines. He was mentioning the unilateralism. My question is that whether he has in mind any official smaller grouping that he thinks that should be introduced in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Mr. Richard, can you
Shall I go first?
reply?
Yeah, I think back in 2014 or 2013, there was kind of a quad discussion, but within the ASEAN, whereby Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei should have come together. This was a proposal by former Philippine Foreign Secretary Albert Rosario. For some reason, of course, it didn't push through. We can understand the hesitations of countries back then. And the Philippines was in the middle of an arbitration case against China, which was very contentious and not very much loved and supported by much of ASEAN, perhaps with the exception of Vietnam. But 6 years forward, we see more and more countries coming up and invoking the Philippine Arbitration Award in one way or another. The Malaysians in some ways, the French, the Germans, and the British much more clearly in a nota verbale, even the Indonesians. Vietnam, more or less since 2016, has supported the key contents of the arbitration award, which rejected the 9-dash line and confirmed more or less the maritime entitlement of smaller countries in the region, including the Philippines. So we have moved a long way from those contentious days in the early 2000s, and I think as we move forward towards 2025 and beyond, I think it's time for not perhaps only Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, but Indonesia or other countries who have similar points of view to come along, and even other countries outside the ASEAN to have more unilateral engagement with us. I mean, China can lean on Cambodia's of this world, and I am not really happy with the Cambodia bashing going on inside ASEAN. I think that's very unfair, as if we in archipelagic Southeast Asia are very helpful to Cambodia and Mekong River issue and among others. But I think the reality is that ASEAN multilateralism is hitting a wall unless we make some significant changes in our decision-making process. As I mentioned, we are in an institutional trap. So I think the logical way forward, which I believe is complementary to, not exclusionary to the ASEAN, is to move forward with the measure of unilateralism. Philippines' decision to take China to arbitration award, 8-9 years ago, it's not supported by ASEAN either officially or even behind the scenes that much. And yet, at the end of the day, our unilateral decision is helping the ASEAN. It has given a legal ammunition to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to Malaysia, to also defend their claims. So we have a clear evidence that sometimes even unilateralism could help the ASEAN as a collective body. Now, at the same time, it worries me that China has the audacity to
try to inject certain provisions into negotiations of COC on whether, countries should have a prerogative on having military exercises with the US or allow foreign companies to come. So I think that audacity in itself is quite worrying, and it shows that ASEAN has to move forward. And if multilateralism is going to be deadlocked the way it has been, let's just not try to sugarcoat it too much, then unilateralism is the way forward. And I think if you're China, you will really take notice if the Indonesias and Philippines and Vietnams of this whole world, together with key Quad partners in Europe, they coordinate more on this issue, put more pressure on China, push forward for boundary negotiations in ways that we can manage and helpfully resolve our maritime disputes in accordance not only to UNCLOS in general, but the specifics of the landmark arbitration award in 2016.
Oh, thank you. We have 2 or 3 minutes for one more question or comments. Any question and comments from the room? Or, yes, please identify yourself.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hoàng Tấn Dũng. I am a former scholar of ASEAN Foundation, and I represent the scientist community of Vietnam, worrying about the issue of South China, South China Sea, or we in Vietnam we call it the East Sea of Vietnam. I would like to raise 2 questions about. Regarding the presentation of the speaker from the Philippines, you mentioned about the divide and conquer strategies that China is now applying to ASEAN countries. So we, as an ASEAN country member, we very much worry about these strategies. And my question is that how ASEAN countries could work together to deal with these strategies. And recently, the Prime Minister of Vietnam and also leaders of ASEAN countries have agreed to sign the regional economic, the comprehensive economic partnership. That I think Vietnam will not benefit much from this partnership agreement. And in this fact, India and the US has refused to join. So could you elaborate more on the thought about the agreement, this agreement? Because I believe that economics plays a very important role in solving the issue of this challenge of the issue of Vietnam, the issue. Thank you.
So, Richard?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm eating the time. I'll keep this as short as possible. It's lovely to talk about China. China is China. I think we know the character of China. And I don't believe, by the way, that China is some sort of an evil empire and it's all negative with China. There's a lot of benefit we can get from China, but we have to play our cards smart. I think it's also important what can other external powers or major powers do. We are going to have a new administration in the United States. I don't think it will either be Trump-like nor Obama-like, right? I think it's going to be a kind of a synthesis of the best elements of the two, right? An element of engagement, but also an element of deterrence. And I think hopefully under the Biden administration and together with key partners in Europe, the Euro 3, I'll just call them there, Australian, Japanese, and others, there's more effort to do capacity building among key countries in ASEAN, whether it's surveillance, intelligence, there should be also more coordination in terms of diplomatic stance. I mean, the Philippines is going to move towards also a new president in the coming years, and I expect the next Filipino president to also take a tougher stance on the South China Sea. Even President Duterte is changing tack. So I think that kind of coordination is also very important as we move forward. And I think in fairness to the Trump administration, despite all of the limitations of its diplomacy in the region, although they have done more freedom of navigation operations and pushed back militarily much better than the Obama administration, is that, for instance, they have openly said they're going to oppose a COC that undermines the interests of the international community in the South China Sea. They have openly said that China's militarization of those islands is unacceptable and has to be reversed. I think the Biden administration and other key powers and Quad members and external powers should also reiterate those points that the militarization of these fish should stop. Militiaization and China's militia deployments in the region should also stop. We should move towards a triple freeze of freeze on new militarization, new militarization, and new military exercises. And we should move towards a kind of accommodation in the region that is not only beneficial for both ASEAN and China, but also for other major powers, because the South China Sea is a global arena. And on the economic issue, I'm actually very disappointed because the headlines keep on saying the RCEP is China-led. I mean, I don't think these people are doing basic research. I think Wikipedia will tell you that it was not China-led. I mean, ASEAN and Japan were behind the RCEP. I think the RCEP resuscitation or finalization shows that globalization is getting some second chance to come back. And under Biden administration, I think we're going to see push more for perhaps an expanded TPP that would bring in Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and hopefully even South Korea, if not Taiwan. And I think the Biden administration will also put more focus on trade and investment initiatives. Yes, it's true, Biden will be a crisis president. A COVID crisis, economic crisis, and post-election polarization crisis. But this is also a president who's coming with a lot of, legacy momentum, right? And I think he wants to really reverse all of the mistakes that were done under the previous administration or outgoing administration. So I won't also underestimate, and knowing the advisors around President Biden, including President Biden, I know they know the nuances of the challenges on the ground, including the necessity for an economic engagement strategy here in ASEAN, because as you correctly pointed out, economics does matter.
So, thank you, and time is up. And before I join the meeting, may I ask you to join me in showing our appreciation and thanks to our panelists and participants for their very substantive and patient contribution to our section.